Good morning, everyone. We're just going to give it a moment for everyone to join, and then we'll get started with today's workshop. Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning again, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for advocating for sexual assault survivors with intellectual and developmental disabilities. My name is Charlotte Hoff, and I am the Communications and Training Coordinator here at MOVA. I'm just going to go over some quick logistics before passing it over to our presenters for today's workshop. This is a Zoom webinar, so you can see the presenters and the ASL interpreters, but you cannot be seen as audience members. If you have questions during the presentation, please use the chat function to ask them. Questions will be answered throughout the presentation. We do have ASL interpretation and CART captioning available during today's workshop. To see the closed captions, go to the bottom of the screen and click on the up arrow next to closed captioning in the Zoom toolbar. Then choose Show Subtitle. If you are having trouble seeing the ASL interpreters, closed captions, or have any other tech issues today, please use the chat function to message either myself or my colleague, Brenna Chase, and we will be happy to assist you. If you do not see either of our names, you can message all panelists and we'll be able to help you from there. After today's session, please let us know any feedback you have by completing the brief evaluation, which we will provide the link to in the chat momentarily, and then again at the end of the presentation. We appreciate your feedback to help us improve future trainings. I'm now going to introduce today's presenters. Nora Grace Clements joined the Victim Rights Law Center in March of 2018 as a staff attorney in the Western Massachusetts office. She provides direct representation to victims of sexual assault in Western Massachusetts with a focus on housing, safety, and privacy matters, as well as working with victims with intellectual and developmental disabilities. She has a background in social justice work, immigration, and domestic violence advocacy. Kelsey Warline joined the VRLC as a staff attorney in early 2013. Kelsey represents rape and sexual assault victims throughout Massachusetts in a wide range of legal areas, including privacy, safety, housing, financial stability, and remedies specific to minors. As an attorney on the VRLC's National Training and Technical Assistance Grant, Kelsey provides individual consultations to legal assistance to victims grantees and conducts trainings on a number of topics, including the civil legal response for sexual assault victims, identifying and addressing the housing needs of sexual assault survivors, working with minor survivors of sexual assault, and safety planning with non-intimate partner sexual assault victims. Thank you so much, Nora and Kelsey, for joining us this morning, and I'll pass it over to you both now.
Thanks, Charlotte. And welcome to all of you who are joining us this morning. We're so excited to see your names and the participants here. So as Charlotte mentioned, we're going to be using the chat box today. So as I'm kind of getting us started here, if you want to introduce yourself in the chat box, just so you can familiarize yourself where it is and how it works, you have the option to chat folks privately. You can chat the whole group. So feel free to start introductions now. Hopefully at this point in this wild year that we've been experiencing, folks are pretty familiar, but just in case, we'd love for you to just say what organization you're from, just say your name, what organization you're from. That would be fantastic. And we are here today to talk about advocating for survivors of sexual assault with intellectual and/or developmental disabilities. And just a couple of notes as we are jumping in. We will probably have a little bit of time for questions at the end, but I really encourage you to ask your questions throughout. We'll answer what we can in the moment. And if we can't get to it in the moment, we'll try to come back to it at the end, or we will, reach out to you individually afterwards. And also note too that we in advocating for survivors with IDD in our work have really learned a lot about how to make our, all of our efforts, all of our services, all of our materials more accessible. So you'll see that we're trying to kind of showcase that a little bit throughout this presentation. We're not, perfect at it. We're definitely still a work in progress. And also, this type of presentation just doesn't lend itself to, using every single principle that we apply in terms of our kind of like long-standing written documents that we're providing clients with. So we're trying to like pepper it in here and there so you can kind of get a feel for it and get a sense of what that looks like. And we're also going to be, we do have interpreters, ASL interpreters on the line. So we are going to be trying to pause at the beginning of each slide just to give folks who are using the interpretation service a chance to, kind of take in the slide before they turn back to the interpreter. So we'll either try and pause or read through the slides ourselves. And I see people have found the chat box, so I'm excited about that. And before we jump in, we're also going to do a quick poll so you can tell us what your role is. And if you do choose other, please feel free to type what that other is in the chat box. And then Charlotte, I'll just rely on you to close that out whenever you feel appropriate. Awesome. Thanks, Charlotte. All right, so we've got a good mix here. This is great. Wow, 30% of others. So yes, please, please say what position you're in if we weren't able to capture it. All right. Fantastic. I assume everyone can see that, but it is, can everyone see the results, Charlotte, on their screen? All right,
yes.
Nora's nodding yes.
Yeah,
awesome.
they can see them.
Perfect. All right, perfect. Well, thank you. We're excited to be here with you all. So I'm just going to jump in. And we're going to start, before we jump into the substance of the presentation, for those of you who might not be familiar, we just wanted to share a little bit about the VRLC. So we provide civil legal services to victims of rape and sexual assault in areas of their life that are affected by the rape or sexual assault. And we represent folks throughout Massachusetts. So you can see here our geographic regions. So we are statewide, and we've got folks kind of peppered throughout the state. And you can see our offices here. We also do have an office in Portland, Oregon, and they do direct services as well. But we just wanted to highlight our Massachusetts services for this particular crowd. So the number that you see there is our main number. So it will take you to our phone system, and then you can kind of navigate through there. We're going to be sharing some direct intake line numbers later on in the presentation. So if you do have survivors that you want to refer to us, we'll give you the various intake lines. And this is just our copyright notice. We are lawyers, so we just throw this out there. Basically, what we ask is just that if you have any interest in using any or part or all of this presentation in your work, please just reach out to us. We want to make sure that you have the most up-to-date version, and that we can support you if you are interested in using that. So how do we help survivors in Massachusetts? So as I mentioned, we're civil legal aid attorneys, so we don't do any criminal defense work. We do work closely with the criminal justice system for our survivors who have cases going through that system. But we don't do any defense work. We don't do, as you'll note at the bottom, any tort suits or just suing folks for money or family law. So no custody, visitation, child support, things like that. And so what we, and just so you know, the reason for that is just that in addition to being serving survivors of sexual assault, we have a particular focus on survivors of non-intimate partner sexual assault And we know about that population that family law is not a significant need for folks who have been victimized by a non-intimate partner. And then we also know that there are quite a few civil legal aid organizations who do have extensive family law services across the Commonwealth. So we're trying to kind of fill a gap that we see. And so that is the reason for that limitation. So what we do offer is privacy, safety, school or education, immigration, work, housing, public benefits, and criminal justice support. So this is kind of the first example that we have of, trying to make our materials a little bit more accessible and using these icons or these visuals along with our descriptions, and also trying to use, more plain language. So typically, we would say education or employment. And what we've learned is that, saying things like school or work have more meaning more broadly across all populations. And so we're trying to make it accessible for everybody. So just to kind of walk you through what we do in these areas, I'm just going to give like a really quick example for each one. So for privacy, we help people do kind of practical privacy in terms of their online presence and things like that, or privacy at work or privacy at school. And then we also do Dwyer hearings in the course of the criminal case, which is it's called a Dwyer or Rule 17 hearing. And that's when the defendant tries to access third-party records, so the victim's records, to bring them into the criminal case for some reason or another. And so for safety, we do protection orders. We also do general safety planning, kind of, again, that more like practical, logistical, walking the survivor through their day. For school, we help survivors who are in primary, secondary, post-secondary school with, gaining access to special education supports, with Title IX complaints, with getting safety accommodations at school, getting extra time to do work or some sort of accommodation so that they can really access their education just as someone who hasn't experienced an assault would. For immigration, we mostly focus on U visas, which are visas for victims of crime. We also do some trafficking visas and some work with special immigrant juveniles. And so helping folks to gain status. All right. And VAWA petitions as well. All right. I'm just trying to keep an eye on the chat. And if you see me looking off to the side, I've got like a multi-screen setup here. So I've got the chat over on one side so that I can kind of focus on the material and on this where my webcam is. So for employment, we help folks with getting accommodations at work, whether that be some sort of parking situation or moving their desk or having their information taken out of public directories. We can also help if folks have been wrongfully terminated as a result of the assault. For housing, again, accommodations so that they can access their housing in the same manner as everyone else. And also we help folks with transferring their tenancy, breaking their leases, if they are facing an eviction as a result of the assault. And for public benefits, helping folks with things like SNAP, which is food stamp benefits, helping folks with transitional assistance, Social Security, just really any sort of financial instability that they're facing as a result of the assault. And then for criminal justice, we do a lot of liaising with the kind of criminal justice system, helping clients understand how the system works, who the different players are, and who they need to contact and be in touch with about their case. And we also do for benefits, victims compensation, so which is just state fund for folks who have experienced a crime and have crime-related expenses. Did I miss anything, Nora? All right. That's just a really brief primer on the VRLC. Okay, so these are our objectives for the day. We're going to define intellectual and developmental disability just to make sure that we're kind of all on the same page as we're talking about this work. And then also, we hope that you'll walk away with an understanding of the disproportionate impact of sexual assault on individuals with IDD. We hope that you'll be able to name at least 2 ways to build rapport with survivors with IDD, And a note on that particular objective, we might have a slide in here that like specifically says Rapport on it, but really this entire presentation is about readying your services for survivors with IDD. And that in itself is just going to be inherently like the foundation for that rapport building. We're also going to talk about kind of like when you're meeting with the client for the first time and those individual communications. So it's going to be really across that whole spectrum from when the survivor first encounters your organization to engaging and meeting with individuals at your organization. And then we're also going to talk about how to navigate working with survivors who have support people. All right, now I'm going to hand it over to Nora.
Thanks, Kelsey. So I think we're going to start off now with a second poll. If you can just answer how many of you currently have clients with IDD that you're aware of, or if you've served clients with IDD in the past, you can also answer yes. And just in terms of the foundation, oh, some of you don't have any clients I'm seeing in the chat, which I appreciate. So thank you for that. And I do see a large number of you have served or are currently serving clients with IDD, so that's great. The answer, I don't know, is an important one and something we'll get to when we're doing intake. It's a question that we ask affirmatively of our clients, and that's an important piece of identifying this population and knowing how to best meet their needs and provide accommodation. So in terms of foundation, I think the most important piece is just to recognize that people experience disability uniquely. Even in terms of how we're going to define disability, those definitions may not be true for everyone. So the big takeaway here is to be as individualized as possible in our approach to each client and in our understanding of each person's disability. Next slide. And intellectual disability is defined usually in most contexts as limitations that a person experiences. So we're going to reframe that. And instead we talk about it as challenges and differences in intellectual functioning and adaptive behavior that may require some accommodation to manage. Intellectual functioning speaks to reading and writing, concepts of money, things like that. Adaptive behavior tends to focus on activities of daily living. So eating, dressing, toileting, using the phone, accessing transportation, preparing meals. So the definition of intellectual disability is a combination of those two. It's typically assessed by standardized testing, most commonly the full-scale IQ testing, and symptoms of intellectual disability begin during childhood or adolescence and typically last for a lifetime. Cognitive disability, Kelsey, next slide, please. Is an umbrella term that includes intellectual disabilities, but also includes other developmental disabilities and disabilities that can affect the physiology of the brain or cognition. Cognitive disabilities can emerge at any time and are not necessarily lifelong. Developmental disability is a much larger category than either intellectual or cognitive disability. Developmental disabilities originate at birth and are expected to continue indefinitely. They are defined typically by challenges in physical, learning, language, or behavior areas. So to talk a bit about the different models of how we view disability. The standard model is the medical model, which focuses on what's wrong with the person who has a disability, sees disability as a deficiency or something to fix. It typically focuses exclusively on the diagnosis and the treatment for that problem. That medical model is disempowering of survivors with disabilities. Decision-making power is usually given to somebody else. And historically, the medical model has led to segregation and institutionalization of people with disabilities. Ultimately, that model is rooted in ableism. The social model, on the other hand, flips the script. So this model focuses on barriers in society that need to be removed. So society and systems are then seen as inaccessible rather than there being something wrong with the individual. Because we see disability as an interaction between the features of a person's body and the society that they live in, any negative experience of navigating programs or spaces can be minimized by designing the environments to accommodate a variety of abilities, providing individualized solutions when they're needed. And it's, I think, important to note that the social model of disability was created by advocates. All right, so we use person-first language as a default when we're talking to and about people with disabilities. An example of person-first language would be a person with autism versus identity first, which would be an autistic person. But again, most important is to listen to how an individual talks about their own disability and use their language. When in doubt, default to person first unless somebody tells you otherwise. So why does this matter and why are we talking about this? I think many of you know that people with individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities are particularly vulnerable to sexual violence. The statistics are staggering. The rate of rape and sexual assault against people with intellectual disabilities is more than 7 times the rate against people without disabilities. And among women with intellectual disabilities, it's about 12 times that rate. There are a lot of factors that increase a person's vulnerability when they have IDD. Some folks with IDD are dependent upon caregivers for assistance with activities of daily living. They may be less likely to be provided with general sex education or education on healthy relationships. They may be socially isolated. They may have been taught to be compliant with caregivers or service providers. And ultimately, rape and sexual assault victims are not usually believed regardless of disability. And so having intellectual or developmental disability adds to their unbelievability, that credibility determination that is made by systems that they interact with. Most important to remember is that survivors with IDD experience the same trauma responses as anybody else. They have additional challenges and barriers which compound that experience, but they are no different in terms of the way that they respond to sexual violence.
And in addition to that, I realized we didn't note at the top. So we use IDD as a shorthand just as kind of a practical matter. And I should note that it's not a term that everyone prefers or likes or identifies with. So even if they've been medically diagnosed, and this kind of goes back to that social versus medical model that Nora was referring to earlier. And I think what we hear from the folks that we work with who are self-advocates is that, kind of going back to that person first language, like Nora mentioned, is that, that labels are not always the most helpful, talking about people and not labels, or, people and not trying to put them in some sort of bucket is what is preferred. But just as a practical matter, we've been working, Nora and I have been working on a grant specifically exploring improving services for survivors with intellectual and developmental disabilities for the last couple of years. And we work with self-advocates in that grant and, a number of community advocates as well. And we collectively as a group have been unable to come up with a better alternative. But I just want to, kind of throw that out there, that is, we are using it because we haven't been able to come up with a better alternative, but it's not necessarily preferred. And also I wanted to add to this slide too, is that folks with IDD, in addition to being at higher risk for victimization, are also at higher risk for repeat victimization. So folks with disabilities generally are more vulnerable. Folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities are more vulnerable to being repeatedly assaulted throughout their lifetime. All right. So now we're going to talk a little bit about connecting with survivors. And this is going to be talking about kind of connecting with them logistically and making sure that they know about your services, are likely to reach you, and also about connecting with them more individually. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And feel free, as I mentioned earlier, if any questions do pop up or any thoughts that you have do pop up and you want to share, please feel free to use the chat. Janice noted that in addition to what we were saying on the last slide, that folks with IDD are also less likely to spontaneously recover from trauma without support. And also less likely to be connected to supports, be aware of supports that exist. And I don't know if Nora mentioned this, but they're also less likely to, in terms of their kind of vulnerability and victimization, they're also less likely to receive kind of sex education as they are growing up and going through school. So that can create barriers in accessing services as well, or even identifying abuse because they haven't had that same foundational education. All right. So we're going to start a little bit talking about intersectionality, and this could be its own webinar. We have, webinars specifically dedicated to working with folks who are living at the point of multiple oppressed identities. And so just kind of note that this could be much longer, but it's not the focus for today. So I'm just going to briefly touch on it. And really, when we talk about intersectionality in this context, what we're talking about is supporting the whole person and understanding how their identities, plural, impact their experience, right? So, we're talking about this population as a population with a disability, so that's going to be one part of their identity, but that's not going to be the only part of their identity that impacts their communication with you, that impacts their interactions with you. And so not kind of reducing someone to that single story, but really making the space for their whole identity. And Kimberly Crenshaw is really kind of credited for coining this term and this term intersectionality, but I think the concept of intersectionality is predates that. We just had a training actually at VRLC. We received training yesterday in doing our own kind of DEI work with relation to disability. And they were, noting that, as far back as 1851, Sojourner Truth was really talking about the concept of intersectionality, even though that term itself may not have existed yet, in her Ain't I a Woman speech. And so talking about, that her identity as not only a woman, but a Black woman, and, what that means for her in terms of how society, was perceiving and treating her in ways that were different than white women. And so, I think the other piece about intersectionality, and we tried to show this with this graphic here, is that it is all intersecting, right? So it's not just talking about, the fact that someone, if you have a survivor who is a Black woman with a disability, it's not just the oppression and discrimination that she experiences as a Black person. It's not just the oppression and discrimination she experiences as a woman. It's not just what she experiences as someone with a disability, right? It's all of that layered together, and that is its own kind of unique intersection. So really kind of honoring where people are in that intersection and making the space for them to bring their whole identity. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later, but it's really, about, it can be really helpful to name that oppression they're experiencing, note that you see that, talk to them about how does that impact what resources they're accessing, how does that impact what remedies they're interested in, because it will make a difference. And like I said, we're going to talk about it later, but they are living at those intersections, but that doesn't mean that they want that to, that is going to impact how they interact with systems, but they may not want to share every aspect of their identity with systems when they're accessing remedies. So we want to make sure that we're really on the same page with them in terms of what it is that they are willing to share to access the remedies that they need. Anything to add on that, Nora? I feel like I just said a lot, but I probably didn't get it all. All right. So at the VRLC, we are advocates of a survivor empowerment model. And what we really mean by this is that survivors know their lives best, and they're in the best position to make decisions about how to proceed. So making sure that we are always turning to the survivor as the expert in what they need and in the expert in their experience. And I think this is particularly important with folks who have intellectual and developmental disabilities, because systems certainly, I think the way that we treat folks with disabilities in our society is to, take on this kind of parental role and guide people, kind of assume that they want our guidance or need our guidance. in decision making, which is not necessarily the case, right? We want to make sure that we're lifting them up as the experts of their own experiences and taking our cues from them so that we are not directing the course of their kind of healing journey. And so
Just for jumping in, Kelsey, I tend to say to clients when they come and we're talking about the options, you see that person with sort of the arrows going in all 4 directions on the previous slide. My job as the advocate may be to tell a client what may happen if we go one way or the other, or if they choose to take one path or another in terms of the goals that they've set for themselves. But at the end of the day, what I say to a client is, you drive the bus, you're in charge of this because you're the one whose life experience will be impacted by the decisions that we make together.
Thanks, Nora. And that's exactly, where I'm headed here. So thank you, Nora. And our role is really to provide that information and explain the possible outcomes. Our role is not to make the decisions. Like as Nora just said, they drive the bus. We have to, let them point us in the direction they want to go, and then we can support them in, accessing that remedy, achieving it, whatever it is that they are interested in doing. So what that means is we cannot make decisions for survivors. And I just want to highlight this, even when the survivor asks you to, right? I'm sure as advocates or professionals who work with victims of any population, you've probably experienced this at some point in your career, because especially if you're working with folks who have just experienced a trauma, they have just experienced a trauma. And so they have a lot going on. It's hard to keep track of everything. It's hard to juggle. It's hard to trust yourself and trust your gut to figure out where you need to go, because you didn't spend any time preparing your life for this trauma. And so you haven't thought about it and you're not prepared to make decisions. So we have clients who turn to us and say, what do you think I should do? And I can't answer the question of what you should do. What I can do as an attorney, as an advocate, and say, well, when we first met, these were the goals and priorities you identified. If these are still your goals and priorities, this is the path that will, take you toward those goals and priorities. But their goals and priorities might change over time. So we always want to be checking in. And again, this is going to be true of any survivor, but I think it's even compounded with folks who have intellectual and developmental disabilities as they are, navigating those additional barriers and challenges that survivors without disabilities are not. So just checking in from time to time, making sure that we're on the same page about what the goals and priorities are. And, I'm happy to give kind of my professional legal opinion, but that's always going to be grounded in what they have stated their goals and priorities are. So we can't tell them what choice to make or what path to take. Okay, so I'm talking about building rapport. So language matters. Nora touched a bit on this in that person first language. So that's one way that we talk about language mattering. We also talk about it with respect to sexual assault. So really making sure that we're mirroring someone's language with respect to their experience as well, and helping, I think also this is again one of those places where I can't define someone's experience for them, right? So if someone comes to me and says, this is what happened, like, am I a victim? Did I experience a sexual assault? I can't tell them, yes, you are, or yes, you did. What I can tell them is that they are eligible for our services, or under the law, this would be viewed as, X, Y, or Z offense. But I can't define, what happened to them or what that experience was for them. So making sure, again, that we're mirroring language without naming or divining things for them. I think it can also be something really simple, and this is like, it gets to kind of the level of minutia and how much this matters, but something as simple as the word story. So sometimes folks will sit down with a survivor and say, okay, tell me your story, what happened? And that word story connotes fiction, right? We use story to talk about, storytelling, about, books that, fiction books that are written. And so certainly it can be used in other contexts as well. We also use, storytelling to not talk about fiction, but that is kind of a collective understanding when someone says, tell me a story. And so that's a word that I avoid. I'm going to say, can you tell me about your experience? because I don't want them to be feeling as though I'm suggesting that anything about their experience is fictional. You know, I want to really come from that place of, you know, believing and supporting and affirming and validating. So that's just like a really specific and really kind of minute example, but just being careful with your language. And again, remembering that intersectionality of, you know, they're being a survivor and they're also being someone with a disability in addition to whatever other identities that they hold. So talking about, again, bringing this back to that intersection of disability and sexual assault, how much do you really need to know? That's a really important question to be thinking about as you're meeting clients, talking to them. It's really hard to share these stories. And it may be really hard to share their experience as someone, you know, kind of growing up with a disability and how the world treated them and marginalized them. So how much do we really need to know? Like, we don't want to be kind of like expecting them to put on this like trauma theater where they walk us through all of the, you know, the traumatic details of their life. I don't need to know that. And they probably don't want to have to retell it all the time. So I may work with a client and never know the full details of their sexual assault because it really depends on what the remedy is that they're seeking. So I would encourage you to think about that for your services. And depending on your services, again, that may or may not make sense for your role. But if it's possible that you can work with a person and help them achieve whatever it is that they came to you for without getting into those details, I think that giving them permission to not share can be really helpful, and allowing them and to engage with your services. And then we want to remind the client, you know, as needed, that we believe them, that we know that no one ever asks or deserves to be assaulted. And this is really kind of just counteracting the rape culture that we are all so steeped in. This again is something that I will just put out there as like a word of caution. I do think that this is really valuable and important. I don't, as a matter of routine, like throw this out to clients immediately and say, yes, I believe you, because I think that there is a certain, I think that can be taken the wrong way by some people in terms of like, well, of course, like, why wouldn't you believe me, right? Like, why does that need to be said? So it's not something that I just say as a routine to every single survivor, right? It's with those survivors who have experienced a system who hasn't believed them or who are having that self-doubt because of the way that they've been treated by systems, and, you know, using that, you know, in my judgment when I feel like it's really valuable for folks to hear it. And then refraining from judgment and assumption. Again, this kind of goes back to they're the experts in their own lives, and we don't want to assume, you know, anything about their experience or how we would have responded in that situation, because we are not living the same kind of truth that they are living, right? We weren't in that experience. We don't hold the same identities. We don't know all the choices that they had available to them. So, you know, really being mindful not to kind of insert yourself into the experience and what happened to the survivor. And then, of course, acknowledging and affirming feelings and reactions, because again, we are all steeped in this rape culture. We see survivors who, you know, might be experiencing a lot of self-blame, a lot of shame around what happened. And so just acknowledging those and, you know, reassuring them, and, you know, like, really there is no wrong response, right, to being sexually assaulted. It's really, you know, everyone's going to be in a different space when they come to you, and there really is no one right way to feel. So just acknowledging and affirming that their reaction is perfectly normal, and you know, that whatever they're feeling in this moment is fine, and that we have no judgment about that. All right. Nora, anything before I move on?
No, I don't think I have anything to add there. Thanks, Kelsey.
Yeah. All right. And then now we're going to talk a little bit about that, kind of that connecting with survivors more broadly and making sure that they will access your services to begin with. So what are the first impressions that your services are putting out into the world? So thinking about your website and that, like, any digital presence you have on social media, what, in terms of like just straightforward accessibility, is your website accessible to someone who uses a screen reader? Is it written in plain language? And we're going to talk more about what plain language means later on. So the first icon that you see on the right-hand side of your screen is an accessibility widget. So Nora knows more about these, so Nora, feel free to jump in than I do, but basically they are widgets that you can add to your website that I think is like a button that is something that they can click to make the website more accessible. And Nora, correct me if any of that is wrong. And then also thinking about your digital space and thinking too about not just that like kind of practical accessibility, but also what kind of message you're sending in your social media on your website. So are you using images that reflect the community that you hope to serve? Will survivors see themselves in your website? Are you specifically noting that you work with folks who have disabilities? Are you specifically noting that you work with LGBTQ identified individuals? And if you have pictures of folks on your, of people on your website, is it a diverse representation? Is it reflecting the community that you're hoping to serve? And then thinking about your physical space. So thinking about the signage and letting folks know what's available in terms of support services. So, we've got this We Welcome Service Animals, we've got the wheelchair accessibility, we've got the symbol for there being audio supports for folks who have any sort of hearing loss. And again, with the welcoming decor and reflecting the community, is your space, is your parking and your building like physically accessible for folks who have mobility issues? So thinking about wheelchairs and walkers. And I think we spend a lot of time focusing specifically on the building itself and like either saying you can measure how wide the hallway is and how much turn space there is in the bathroom and how much clearance there is under the sink. But you also want to be thinking like kind of big picture. And we just did an audit of our Worcester office. So, we are kind of like, this is fresh in our minds, but, our space is like the building is accessible. But when we looked at like our parking and accessibility for public transportation, and the building is on a pretty significant hill, thinking about someone who has mobility issues, it's like, yes, they can navigate the building, but can they navigate to the building, right? Like the accessibility of the building is only helpful if they can actually get to the building. So really taking that like bigger picture view of accessibility. And then for outreach materials, I think I touched on all of that. And then for community connections and warm referrals, really identifying where your, kind of target population is already receiving services. Because, for example, if you're like, we've had to kind of think about our intake process. And our intake process requires you to call a number and then like navigate a name directory and then leave a message and wait for a call back. That's not something that every survivor can do. So the way that we kind of get around that for folks who might not be able to do that is through our community connections and making sure that the advocates who survivors are more likely to speak to before they speak to us know how to reach out to us individually directly. They know that we can reach out to survivors rather than waiting for survivors to reach out to us if the survivor is unable to navigate our phone system. So making sure that we have those community partnerships and are communicating that to them.
Just one more note about the accessibility widgets. That's just one example. It's the one that we use on the Victim Rights Law Center website. And so if a person were to go to the website and click on it, it gives options for things like a screen reader, adjustments in contrast, bigger text, text spacing, line height. And so it's an investment certainly to add an accessibility widget to a website, but it makes the service entirely more accessible for folks to be looking into what you offer and reaching out. So before we jump in too much to communicating with survivors, Kelsey just mentioned some barriers and some ways that we might begin to think about overcoming those barriers for folks with IDD in accessing our services. Can you tell us in the chat briefly about a time any of you have experienced a communication barrier with a client or with a person, for those of you who don't have clients, who may have intellectual or developmental disability? And we'll keep track of that chat as I get started in this section.
What barriers have you faced in working with folks with IDD?
So as Kelsey mentioned, one of the questions that we ask first is when we're sort of doing our own audit of our services, is to sort of think about, will our clients even make it through to intake? So as Kelsey mentioned, our intake process in and of itself, the way that it typically functions, can be a barrier to folks accessing our services. And so those direct referrals and the flagging of clients who might be coming to us or who self-identify with IDD who wouldn't be able to access that is very helpful for us to be able to modify the intake process to make it accessible. For folks with IDD, that often means an in-person intake versus a phone intake. Or it may be reaching out, like Kelsey mentioned, to the survivor directly as opposed to waiting for them to call in, leave a message and receive a call back, which can be cumbersome. I'm seeing some responses in the chat, so thank you. I think we'll touch on some of these. And we'll definitely be talking about a support person in a little bit during this section.
And Nora, those are just to, well, it looks like it's to panelists that you may want to, any that you want to highlight, you may want to read, because I don't think everyone can see them.
I'm sorry, Kelsey, can you say that again?
I don't think everyone can see the chats because it says that they're to all panelists.
Oh, that's right. Okay, so I'll read them aloud then. Thank you for highlighting that. So seeing that folks have clients who are hesitant to speak at all, a client with a traumatic brain injury who has limited ability to audibly vocalize. Another person mentioned clients needing a support person that they trusted to be physically with them during the meeting. And keep adding to that chat, I'll read them aloud as they come in. So when we meet with a client, we want to make sure that we talk about our services, but that we ask about disability and accommodations as early as possible. In order to make the services truly accessible, we need to be upfront and clear about what a client may need to be able to access our services as they would if they did not have a disability. So we don't shy away from the question around disability. We ask directly, do you have a disability? And if they identify a disability, we may ask what accommodations they need. And one way to ask that is just to say, how can I help make this possible for you? How can I make it easier for you to work with me? Again, it's going to be very individualized. Everybody has particular needs. And so we want to document what those requests are and make sure that we're prepared to meet them. It's one thing to ask the question, but we really should not move forward with any interaction or future work with the client until we are able to meet the accommodation needs that they have identified. So that takes preparation on our part. It can take flexibility in scheduling and in meeting folks in person, potentially, like I mentioned, in terms of intake. So some of the things, oh, go ahead, Kelsey.
No, I was just going to add, for folks who are feeling like, how do I ask about disability? Isn't that like uncomfortable? Isn't it awkward? Isn't it rude? This is kind of one of those things about, kind of getting over our own, discomfort. And if the person, when we ask if someone has a disability, we don't say, okay, so tell me all about your tell me all the details of your disability. That's not what we're looking for. If someone says, I have a disability, we don't ask which ones. We say just what Nora said. Okay, so is there anything that you need to be able to access our services more easily? Is there anything I can do to help make this process easier for you? And some folks, are more than happy to share the details. Others might just say, yes, I have a disability, and then just opening that door, they may not give you any ideas in that moment, because there's a decent chance that they're surprised that someone is, being proactive about trying to plan for their needs. But it opens the door so that if they do need something down the road, then they can, they can feel comfortable and know that you're receptive to it. And if someone does seem put off by the question, why do you want to know that? Then we just explain, we want to make sure that our services are accessible. And so we always ask people if there's anything they need to use our services. And again, they may not feel comfortable disclosing, but now you've left that door open.
Right, exactly. And to that point, I think often our clients will not answer the question or not feel comfortable at the outset, but will, after there's been some rapport building and getting used to working together, they may open up further about both what their disability consists of and more importantly, what accommodations they need once they start to trust us in the work. There are clients who identify disability upfront, and there are others, depending on the disability, who may not. So there are some invisible disabilities that we wouldn't know by looking at a person, by speaking with the person until we get to know them better. or if at all. And those are, we leave it up to the client when they are ready to disclose. So some of the things that we can do and we can offer when a client does identify accommodations, and we'll get more into specific accommodations later, but just in terms of establishing clear expectations and timelines, it's really helpful for folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities to understand what's going to happen in the meeting, to work with the client to prepare an agenda for that meeting, and to have a structure that you've negotiated with the client that works well for communication. So keeping in mind limitations the client may have, they may need to have shorter and more frequent meeting times. They may, like I mentioned, may need to meet in person, be cognizant of transportation, scheduling issues that a client may have. Clients are often reliant upon service providers for transportation to meetings, and so they may need to coordinate or ask you to coordinate with those service providers in order to make it possible to meet. So as Kelsey talked about when she was discussing intersectionality, disability is compounded by trauma and vice versa. So the experience of trauma may be compounded by additional vulnerability and marginalization with whatever identities a person may hold. And so just keeping that in mind is critically important in terms of what additional accommodations a person may need. And what this slide also speaks to is just the relief that a client may feel when you identify that this is going to be difficult to talk about, and how they may experience triggers by not only the conversations that you're having with your client, but also the systems that they will have to interact with. So by way of example, the legal process itself may be a trigger if you're in the legal field, which we are. So that pieces of that process that can be triggering would include just talking about what happened, the limited legal options that a person has, being in a courtroom, which they, whether they have a disability or not, may never have had that opportunity to experience what a courtroom looks like and feels like, the number of people that are in the room, not knowing whether there will be an audience or other folks from the public in the room with them, talking about the perpetrator's defense, and ultimately just being judged and evaluated by a finder of fact may be triggering for a person with a disability who has experienced judgment from a community, from systems, potentially their entire life. So as an advocate, what we can do to mitigate this is to have a conversation with our clients about what we can do to help when this comes up for them. We can't change the systems, although we may want to in as many ways as we would like, but we can strategize with the client about how to address what comes up with them, for them when we're interacting with other systems. And if it's not the legal field, I think about the same things in the field that you are in. How can you plan with a client to address and help them navigate through the triggers that they experience?
And acknowledging that you might be a trigger as well, because if they associate you with having to talk about what happened or having to engage in these other triggering systems. So if you find that clients are not as responsive, as you would like or need them to be, that could be disability related, that could be trauma related, it could be a combination of those. So having a conversation with them about what's going on, and maybe it's just as simple as letting them know in advance of each meeting, we're not going to talk about the details for this meeting. And that might put their mind at ease. Ready for the next slide, Nora?
Yes, thank you. So ongoing communication with clients with intellectual and developmental disabilities, as with any client, is individualized. It requires planning and patience, and it has to be 100% interactive with the survivor. So one thing I just want to highlight here is that while I think there's always a focus on making sure that our clients are understanding us, and we'll talk more about that in the next slide, but here, just to emphasize, it's equally important that we ensure that we are understanding the client fully. So slowing down, remembering that that what matters is that we elevate the survivor's voice. And so to do that, we need to figure out a method that works for both us and for the client. One idea, and what's highlighted here in the practice tip, is to confirm what we're hearing by repeating it back and making sure that the survivor can acknowledge that that's correct, that we heard them correctly. We want to understand clearly what their goals are so that we can work together to identify potential solutions or paths to follow. And in terms of a client's own understanding of what we're talking about and what the context of the meeting might be, keeping in mind that individuals with IDD can experience functional difficulties with memory, with problem solving, attention, with reading, sometimes with verbal comprehension even. So we may need to take breaks. We may need to give them tools to hold, or sort of other accommodations that may work for them to be able to maintain attention during the meeting. We may need to be writing things down as we go and giving them a list to take with them. So when we're assessing for their communication style and what their needs are, we have to be comfortable asking those questions again directly. So some questions we could ask would be, can you tell me how you prefer to communicate? Or what is the best way to share information with you? Is there anything I can do that would help you? Is there anything I should know about how you communicate? And again, tell me some things that would be helpful to you when we talk. So we're just setting the stage for the survivor to lead the conversation. They're telling us what they need, and we have to, again, be prepared to meet them wherever they're at. So again, don't just ask, do you understand, when you're trying to explain something to a survivor, really to any survivor, but particularly a survivor with IDD. We want to make sure to ask simple questions, not compound questions. For a person who's experienced trauma, attention can be difficult regardless of disability, and following compound questions and understanding sort of the implications of those and where to even jump in with an answer can be difficult. So we want to break things down into small chunks and ask simple questions as much as possible. Our goal when representing an individual is to ensure the complete understanding of the concepts we're talking about on both sides, for us to understand our client's goals and for us to walk away with a mutual understanding of the next steps. There also may not be a communication barrier, but to be safe, just keeping in mind things like a client with IDD who's been socialized and trained sort of by society in the ways that they've interacted with systems throughout their lives to answer reflexively to a question. They may perceive you to be a person with authority. No matter how approachable we make ourselves, we as service providers are gatekeepers and very often perceived as a person with some form of authority by our clients. Clients may answer yes or no questions without even understanding the question. We call that the empty yes. So they're answering because they think that they have to, but we want to make sure that they really understand what the question was and how, and so that they can answer appropriately. A client might answer a question based on what they think that they should say or what you want them to say. And be mindful of perhaps unintentional body language. So for instance, if you are nodding along as a client is answering, that could be perceived as affirmation that they are giving the correct answer to your question, as opposed to just active listening, which might be the intention behind that. So reiterate to your clients that their answer is the only correct answer. And our job is just to clarify the question. If they need help with understanding what the question is, we may craft multiple ways to ask any one question, particularly one that's important. Another tool that we use there is briefly is to draw diagrams. I mentioned earlier writing things down as we go. We will draw out layout of the courtroom, for example. We will also try to bring clients to the courtroom in advance of having to appear for a hearing or proceeding, just so they can see it in person. But in a meeting, we can draw pictures. We can sort of identify who the players are, where people will sit, who else will be in the room. And we do that with all of our clients. Like I said, many people, or most people, have never been party to a lawsuit or ever stepped foot in a courtroom. And so while we're familiar with that setting, our clients are not, and will feel reassured by the explanation and diagrams that we can give them. Anything you want to add there, Kelsey? Okay. So if a client requests a support person, we need to accommodate that. In the legal field and with attorney-client privilege, it's something that folks tend to stay away from or be nervous about in terms of maintaining attorney-client privilege or even establishing attorney-client privilege. But the most important thing is that the person with whom we are working feels able to access our services, and sometimes that requires having another person in the room. If in the presence of a third person, it's really important that we continue to speak to the survivor, not to their support person. People with IDD report going to medical appointments and appointments with lawyers and appointments with other service providers with a support person present, and the service provider is communicating about the individual with the support person as opposed to communicating with the individual directly. I see a question in the comments about recording, and yes, this will be recorded. So I'll defer to you, Charlotte, about whether the recording will be provided out to all attendees afterwards.
Yes, we'll share the recording with all attendees in a follow-up email.
Okay, thank you. So again, speak to the survivor, not to the support person. And before you start a substantive dialogue with a survivor with IDD about sexual trauma, take time to gently assess their communication abilities. So that can be a really good time to have a support person in the room. We don't need that information to be privileged. And sometimes it's just a matter of a few minutes of sort of establishing that rapport, taking time together to talk about communication or get to know each other before the client feels comfortable speaking with us privately.
And I think Nora mentioned earlier, or perhaps will come up soon, but sometimes more frequent but shorter meetings are really helpful for this population. And I think this is another way that can be helpful, is if you have that first meeting with the support person there, it gives the survivor time to kind of get acclimated, be comfortable, kind of get a sense for how accessible your services are, right? Because if you are, they may be accustomed to having the support person because they're used to an inaccessible world. So if we can show them that we are making our services accessible and meeting them where they are, and letting them have that time to acclimate in that initial meeting, maybe follow-up meetings, they may not feel like they need that person there for every single one. And certainly, you all may have different privileges to consider as well, depending on your role. So this is certainly at the forefront of our mind as attorneys, but it may be the case for you as well. And thinking too about, I think there's different types of support people, right? Like there's folks who are really critical to communication, and there are other folks who are primarily offering that kind of emotional support. And that's not to say that, one is, better than the other, or, to treat them differently, because I don't think we do. I think we rely on what that person needs. But in terms of thinking about it as with respect to your privilege, if the person needs a support person to actually communicate with you, then that person's going to be necessary to the conversations. They're going to be folded into that privilege. I think it gets a little bit more gray when you're talking about emotional support. But just, don't be so focused on your privilege if you have one that that you're, worrying about it so much that someone who really needs that in order to communicate, in order to engage in services, is feeling unsure if they can bring that person in.
Yeah, thank you. So we're talking about interacting with systems, and I think Kelsey talked earlier about how much do you really need to know when you're asking a client about their experience of sexual assault or their experience of disability. The same is true in terms of the way that we want to think about how much about a person's disability or other identities that they hold actually need to be disclosed, or what the purpose might be for disclosing that in systems that we're interacting with. So thinking about our role as a gatekeeper of information and of access, and considering the privacy implications in disclosing disability when interacting with systems. There can be a benefit that accrues from having disclosed a disability. There may be a request for a reasonable accommodation for which there is a need to disclose disability. But I think it's really important that not only do we consider what the purpose is of disclosing disability, but that we have that conversation with the client, because we may not be able to anticipate all of the potential impacts on the person's life, on their case, that making a disclosure publicly or in some systemic forum could have on that person. So it could have an impact on a case in terms of stigma that the systems hold, in terms of credibility determinations, Also, if disclosures are made in the presence of another gatekeeper in that person's life, it can have an impact on all aspects of the individual's life. So decisions about sharing disability or disclosing disability should really be the client's decision, not ours, just like any other decision in their case. But it's important, particularly here, that we check ourselves. So we check ourselves on our ableism, our own bias, and be mindful of the same with the systems with which we interact. Our reliance upon systems and familiarity with systems that may not be accessible to clients may have even greater implications for them in terms of maybe deciding not to disclose disability. For instance, in a restraining order hearing, I may go into court and the client may have said, I don't want you to tell anybody about my disability. And because it's an invisible disability, the court won't know. In other instances, the clients are comfortable and feel that it's important to disclose for whatever contextual reason applies in their case. And so again, we leave that up to the client, but we have to offer that full range of options and be careful to check ourselves in sort of making assumptions about what a client might want or what might be appropriate for them.
I'll also just add there too, I think Nora and I have both touched on this, but I don't know if we've like said it outright, which is that, you know, the survivor's goals and priorities are paramount, right? We've talked about that. That's going to drive our representation or our advocacy. But our job in terms of supporting them towards those goals is making sure that they are making informed decisions. So if a survivor comes in and says, like, privacy is the number one thing, I absolutely don't want anyone to know about my disability, I don't want to disclose that, that's not like the end of that conversation, right? You know, when we're visiting remedies, we don't just say, okay, like we'll never talk about it again, we'll never bring it up. When we're talking about remedies or, you know, options that are available to them, you know, for example, a restraining order, we might say to them, like, I understand that you don't want to share your disability. You know, I just want to check in about that. I know that's like a priority of yours. We absolutely can pursue this remedy without talking about your disability, but I do think the court would find it compelling if they knew, and I think it would improve your chances of success. So with that in mind, does that impact your decision at all? And it may not. They may say, no, I still like privacy is more important. Like my privacy is more important than the protection order. So I'd rather, even if it means that I don't get the protection order, I would rather hold on to that. Or they may take a minute and think about it and say, well, maybe just like, I'll share this small piece of it. Because sharing like disability doesn't mean we have to share the entire picture, right? Like we can just share like the relevant piece. Or, you know, I have clients where, you know, whether it's a protection order or some other remedy, like their priority is to not share it. So like that's their goal, or their goal is to not share it, but their priority is to get the remedy. Then I'll say, okay, like we will go in with the plan of not sharing it. But if things are not looking good for us, I may look at you in that moment and say, is now the time to share it? So preparing them for that, because obviously to make a decision in the moment is really challenging. So one, preparing them for the fact that I'm going to look to them and say, how do you feel about it now? You know, if we can take a break to talk about it in that moment, then we would ask the, you know, the fact finder or decision maker or wherever we are to take a break to talk to our client, but letting them know so that they can have time to think about it. And so that they're not kind of on the other side of a protection order where they, you know, maybe haven't gotten it because they didn't feel comfortable sharing everything, kicking themselves going, now I really wish I had said something. I wish I had gotten the order, because it's harder to go back and try again, right? It's not impossible, but it can be challenging. And then, you know, to Nora's point about credibility, you start getting these questions of like, why didn't you bring that up before? Like, why are you coming back here with it now? You knew it before and you didn't say anything. Excuse me. So just making sure that they are, just because they've said, I don't want to do this one thing, that doesn't mean we then stop all conversation about remedies that require that one thing. We, you know, revisit that and say, I understand this is not your priority. I just want you to know it's available. So if you want to talk about it, we can. If your priorities shift, let me know, that kind of thing.
And along the same lines, I forgot to mention, but I'm glad that you brought that up, Kelsey, because it jogged my memory. In terms of language, when we're talking about, it goes back to the social model and the medical model, when we're interacting with systems. When we're meeting with our clients one-on-one, we're going to be using the social model. That's how we think about disability, and that's the language that we use to talk about disability. But the law, for example, is not written with the social model in mind. And so when we're, for instance, requesting a reasonable accommodation, that would require us relying a bit more on statutory language, which reflects the medical model. And so just being upfront with our clients, letting them know that that would be the next piece of the next step in the process. And that if we're going to have to submit something in writing, we're going to have to rely on that language. That would not be our preferred language, and making sure that they don't feel sort of blindsided by that if they ever read or hear a judge or another fact finder talking in that sort of medical model, which is so disempowering to survivors. So just prepping for them for that, and prepping them also for our role in using that language when interacting with those systems is important.
Now we're going to go into talking about accommodations. This is going to be the last kind of section that we touch on. So if you do have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. If you've been hanging on to anything that you're wondering about, feel free to put it in the chat, and we can address those as we move forward. All right, so when it comes to accommodations, our goal is really to provide any adjustments needed to provide equal access to services for all sexual assault survivors. So we want someone with a disability to be able to successfully access our services in the same way that someone without a disability can. So our responsibility in meeting that goal is to be prepared to make those requested accommodations. So, as Nora touched upon earlier, if someone identifies in the very first call that the phone doesn't really work for them, we're not just going to kind of power through and be like, well, we'll focus on meeting in person in the future. Like, we're going to kind of pause right there and then make that phone call about the planning of an in-person meeting. And so, whether that is, maybe they could, if you're on the phone with just a survivor by themselves, maybe you can walk through that with them. Maybe even that is like, I think, the question might be, do you feel like we could schedule, like use this time to schedule an in-person meeting? Do you need a support person to be able to schedule an in-person meeting? Because as Nora mentioned too, so often folks with IDD are dependent on transportation systems and support people. And so it may not even be, may not make sense to even go that far into the conversation. So we just need to kind of figure that out, but be prepared to make that. And then of course, also that we are budgeting for making these accommodations, right? So, similar to how I'm sure your organizations probably all have budgets for like language line access or interpreter access. Similarly that we are budgeting for accommodations that folks with disabilities need to have that equal access. And that we have, there's certain things, like we did our review of our office and it's like, well, we can't install an elevator in this building that we're renting offices out of. So that's not something that's practical, right? So we need to think about, if someone can't get into the building, then where can we meet in the community? So, having those kind of community relationships with partners in your community, thinking about what kind of public services are available. You can rent rooms, or not rent, but reserve rooms at the library often. So, thinking about what other options are available and kind of having that kind of list, already ready to go before the person walks in the door, so that you can kind of be more responsive and more quick about it when you do get that survivor who has a disability. So I'm going to put it out to you in the chat. What are some accommodations? I think Nora and I have touched on a few, but what are some accommodations that you can think of for making sure that your services are accessible? And it may look different. We, as we mentioned, we're attorneys, so we kind of have that lens in mind. But in your field of work, in your organization, what are some accommodations that you can see survivors needing, or that you might be able to offer, or that you have offered in the past? And we have some ideas. We're going to share those. We've already shared some, but we'd love to hear from you and what has worked for you in your work in the past. So if you could put that in the chat. One person said office space. Can you say a little bit more about that, Sandra? For all of its many advantages, Zoom does not show me when people are typing. So I'll just give it another minute and see if folks can share some accommodations that they've made. Oh, okay, so not all of the advocates have office space, so finding a place to meet. And obviously, even if you don't have a particular privilege, privacy is really important for survivors generally and survivors with disabilities. So identifying safe spots in the community, connecting with other survivors in the community, because so many survivors lack supports whom they can release to. Court service center type services, who they can relate to. Thank you. Yeah, so what you're talking about here is, some planning ahead, which I love. The more prepared we are, then the better services we can offer, and the more seamless and it will be, and the more that their experience will reflect that of someone who is abled. Yeah, asking courts if they can use a room so that you have that privacy. If you're meeting at the court, it's hard to have conversations in the hallway, even if you have no disabilities, right? Even if you have no trauma, it gets loud, it gets echoey. It can feel very exposed. So when you compound that with trauma, and that your brain may feel a little bit scattered because of the trauma, and you may have trouble, focusing and holding on to details, and you compound that with disability, for example, especially if you have a hearing disability, that's just going to get worse and worse. So that's great. All right, feel free to keep typing those in. Just keeping an eye on the time here so we can leave a moment or two for questions at the end. So these are some of the ones that I think we've actually touched on a bit already, but oftentimes with folks with IDD, we have more frequent but shorter meetings. So, meetings may be kind of topping out at 20, 30 minutes rather than, 90 minutes like we might do with some survivors. And, really, again, this is all about being individualized, as Nora has mentioned. So checking in with the survivor about what works for them. It also could be that you just take more breaks throughout the meeting. And when you're thinking about breaks, it's one thing to say, you can tell me if you need a break. You can take a break whenever you want. But again, as Nora mentioned, we're kind of like these gatekeeper, like quasi-authority figures when it comes to accessing remedies, and telling someone that they can take a break may not actually leave them feeling empowered to exercise that choice. So if you can see that someone needs a break, it's just suggesting, like, why don't we take a break? Like, why don't we come back in 5 minutes, get some water, kind of like take a minute. I tend to say, I've just given you a lot, I've just dumped a lot of information on you. Do you want to, even on the phone with survivors who haven't identified a disability, because again, we're working with folks who have experienced trauma, I'll say, do you want to keep going, or do you want to have another call in a couple days? And I can't tell you, survivors will be like, no, I'm good, let's keep going. And then you get literally 3 sentences in, and they're like, actually, you know what, continuing this another day would be great, let's do that. So kind of just opening the door, giving that space, or planning the kind of breaks in advance and saying, we're going to talk about this, then we're going to take a break, so that it's built in and doesn't kind of put it on them. We also have talked to folks about having some sort of card that they can hold up when they need a break. This is great if folks do struggle to verbalize, but it's also great if someone's, just having just really in the trauma and having an emotional experience. It doesn't require them to say anything. They can just hold up the card, and you've agreed that means, we'll take a break and come back in however many minutes. So it doesn't require them to feel like they have to explain or justify. They can just hold that up. Creating and sharing lists. So this can be great in terms of kind of options. It can also be great in terms of next steps. When we are meeting with someone, we kind of have this here's my homework, here's your homework. So here's what we're both going to do before we meet next. So creating that list and letting them know, this is what I'm going to do, this is what I need you to do. And then Nora described using pictures or simple photographs or diagrams to, familiarize folks with what it is that we're talking about. So that's the courtroom, or how a Title IX process works, or whatever it might be, having that drawn out. And again, this is very individualized. So we're creating right now some kind of some diagrams and infographic type things that we will have like as a more general resource, but we also do this on the fly in the meetings with our clients because it is so individualized, and what works for one person may not work for someone else. They may need it to be drawn or depicted a different way. So, if you're going to do that draw that for them in your meetings, and then make a copy and let them take a copy home with them so that they can refer back to it later. All right. And then repeating information as needed. And again, this comes back to that patience piece that Nora was mentioning earlier. And, not only just repeating it as needed, but obviously we want to not be conveying that we're like exasperated or frustrated or anything like that, which is a daily test that I face with my children. So, and not one that I always pass. So it's certainly something I'm aware of that I need to work on, but, making sure that we create that space and talk through things, or, listening, as Nora was mentioning, for cues about understanding, so that if it feels like maybe there is something missing, that we can kind of know to go over it again. And then allowing time for that things to be fully processed. I think that's kind of touched on all of that. And then giving that information in clear, concise, concrete, and simple steps, so that really, and again, this can be helpful for explaining systems. It can also be helpful for explaining, our work and what our next steps are going to be. All right. And then for plain language, we are just talking about making it more universally accessible. So for plain language, we're talking about using, fewer kind of compound sentences, using words that have fewer syllables, using the icons and pictures as we've talked about, easy to read fonts like Arial, Helvetica, Calibri, making sure that the color contrast is strong so that folks with low vision can read it. And then not relying solely on color, because again, folks with vision impairments or color blindness may not be able to navigate if you have things in color. And there are accessibility checkers available online that you can use to kind of run your documents or your content through, and they'll give you feedback on the accessibility of it. And so we're just going to give a sample. So we're almost done. So I'm just going to give you a sample of some work that we've done in terms of using plain language and making things more accessible. And really, what this is all about is that universal design piece, that universal accessibility is, we're going to do this and make it as universally accessible as possible. And what that means is we're not creating this like separate set of documents for this separate population, but recognizing that we want something that everyone can access. And if we design it correctly, then it should work for everyone. And I encourage you to look into universal design. We are still kind of wrapping our heads around it ourselves, but it means different things kind of in different contexts. So if you're talking about the universal design of like a physical space, like a train station, that's going to be obviously a different conversation than if you're talking about universal design for a written document. All right. So we are just going to give you some examples from our own work. So we have brochures and things that summarize our services for survivors and community partners. So this is our before, and it to someone who is able-bodied, like I look at this, I'm like, oh, these are nice, pretty colors. Like it's it's got like a pleasing look to it, sure. But if you are looking at this and you have low vision, the contrast may not be enough. Or if you experience color blindness, this may be difficult to navigate. Other issues with this are, this is not the most accessible font. We've got things in parentheses, which is not best practice. We've got, as you'll see on the second bullet, we've got words that start on one line and then continue on to a second line. Again, that's not best practice. And certainly, again, kind of coming back to like, obviously we are still a work in progress, and some of the things lend themselves more readily to this process than others. And if you're trying to make like a trifold brochure, it may be more challenging to do some of these things. which is how they ended up like this in the first place, because they had that limited kind of width. So that's how we ended up going on to a second line with some of these words. But if you see, this is what we looked like before. And then if you look, you'll also see too, like the language is not complex, but I think you'll see in the next version that it is possible to simplify this language to make it clearer, and to someone who does have a disability, or who might have limited English proficiency, or whose reading level might not be as high. So going to the next one. So this is our after. And so you'll see we took and simplified the language. We got rid of kind of the parentheses, the words carrying over from one line to another. And then it is longer. That tends to be the case when we take documents, because when you're taking and breaking up longer sentences and, you know, explaining concepts in simpler language, it can take up a little bit more space. But I think the result is that you are going to you're going to see that it's more accessible, it's simpler to read, it conveys the information more clearly. And then we also added up in the top, you'll see in the top right, and again, this is an example of it having to adapt it for PowerPoint slides. This isn't exactly what it looks like on the paper, but we use these symbols to, these icons to kind of try and convey school or education. And for our purposes, trying to convey kind of different levels of education, right? Like we serve folks in K through 12, which is what that image on the right tends to speak to a little bit more. We also serve people in campus settings. And so trying to really convey that spectrum. All right. That is our last substantive slide. And so we do have a slide with resources. I'm going to leave this up for a minute just so folks can read it and look at it. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to enter those into the chat. You can also reach out to us individually, and I'll just put my email in here. Nora, I will leave that up to you. I just put my email in the chat. As did Nora. And then we also have this list of resources, which for ease of clicking on, we made into hyperlinks for you, but I realized you cannot click on those through the presentation. So let me see if I can paste those into, we'll just send these out. We'll work with Charlotte to send these out in a way that you can actually click on them post presentation, because it's not looking like they're going to go into the chat. And then in terms of our contact information for our organization, if you have referrals that you want to make, these are intake lines. But again, if you have anyone who cannot navigate the intake process, feel free to reach out to us directly. Or you, if you're an advocate, can call this number and leave a message that you're calling on behalf of someone you're working with, and we'll connect with you and figure out how to successfully connect with that survivor in a way that works for them. All right, and here is Mova's information.
Feel free to put any final questions you have in the chat, as Kelsey said, but thank you, Nora and Kelsey, for this super informative presentation today. As we mentioned previously, we'll be sharing the recording with everyone who attended today, as well as a PDF version of the slides, and I'll also include Kelsey and Nora's contact information in that follow-up email as well. And we would appreciate any feedback you all have about this presentation. Always trying to improve our future trainings and events, so we'll include that link in the follow-up email as well. Brenna also just put that along with a few other links in the chat. And tomorrow we do have another training with DPH about the Sexual Assault Nurse Examiner program. So if you're interested in attending that, there's a link in the chat for that.
And thank you to you, Charlotte and Mova, for hosting us and giving us this opportunity. So we're always excited to share what we're doing. So we appreciate everyone's interest.
Oh, it's always our pleasure. All right. I don't see any final questions, but again, I'll include their contact information. So if you have other questions, just feel free to reach out to them. Thank you all so much, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Charlotte.